Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pasteur.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you not one but two fascinating guests today, helping to create a better tomorrow in a very unique area. As a little background to today's show, Combating Antibiotic Resistance Bacterial Biopharmaceutical Accelerator, or CARBX, is a global nonprofit partnership that's focused on accelerating antibacterial products to address drug-resistant bacteria, which is a leading cause of death around the world. It's estimated around 1.3 million deaths worldwide were attributed to resistant bacterial infections in 2019. And the CARBX portfolio is the world's most scientifically diverse, early development pipeline of new antibiotics, vaccines, rapid diagnostics, and other products, and represents the only global partnership that specifically focused in this area to integrate solutions for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of these life-threatening bacterial infections, ultimately helping to translate innovation from basic research to first-in-human clinical trials. We have two wonderful guests today. First, we're joined by Dr. Erin Duffy, who's Chief of R&D at CARBX. She has 2 decades of drug discovery and problem-solving experience in the antibiotic area. She was previously with Rib-X, now Melinta Therapeutics. There, she helped build and sustain a team of researchers translating the company's scientific platform into next-generation novel antibiotics, specifically targeting ribosome. Her team's work resulted in the development of a completely new class of antibiotics, the pyrrolocytosines, which is partly supported by CARBX. Prior to that, Erin was Associate Director of Innovative Discovery Technologies at Achillion Pharmaceuticals and began her industrial career at Pfizer Central Research in Groton. She was originally trained at Yale. She became a physical organic chemist and then expanded her experience beyond small molecules to large molecules a little later on. We'll also have the honor of being joined by Kevin Outterson, who is Executive Director of CARBX. He is a global thought leader in business models for antibiotic development and use. He's a professor of law and Neil Pike Scholar of Health and Disability Law at Boston University School of Law. He is also Executive Director and Principal Investigator of the CARBX and partner at Drive AB, which stands for Driving Reinvestment in Research and Development Responsible Antibiotic Use, a EU-centric program. Also leads the Social Innovation on Drug Resistance program at BU. Two fascinating guests, and we are lucky to have them, Dr. Erin Duffy and Kevin Outterson. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's great having you both on this extremely important topic that I don't think it gets enough press as of late. And, I would love to start off by handing you both the floor just for a few minutes each to just further talk about how you both arrived at sort of this domain. Erin, of course, you from the R&D perspective, Kevin from a policy perspective. Take a few minutes each just to further introduce yourself and how you both got to CARBX, if you would.
Kevin, I think I'll follow you on this one.
All right. So, I'm a law professor, and last time I took chemistry was a long time ago. Erin is our lead chemist. But I began looking at the ways that patents either worked or didn't work in the R&D space for drugs 20 years ago. And there's a lot of ways in which patents are useful. They're the foundation of our biotech industry. There's also ways in which they could be improved, especially how the drugs aren't distributed fairly enough and adequately enough around the world to the poorer populations that can't afford them. We've seen this recently with COVID, right? The vaccines readily available in the wealthy countries, different story in the rest of the world. But I was writing a long article. A lot of your articles are excessively long. It's actually for a journal at Yale, but unrelated to Erin's time there. And it was detailing all the theory of how patents work and don't work in the sector. But one of the key assumptions is that at least at the end of the patent period, the world gets the generic drug, and that generic drug is excellent, And so the worst that the world has gotten is a delay of 10 to 14 to 20 years tops, and that's not a bad bargain. It's actually called a patent bargain. Sure. But then I dropped a footnote saying that wouldn't be true if somehow what the world got when it went generic was degraded, was not as useful as the original product. For example, what about products that degrade with use over time, like an antibiotic? And I just went on and wrote the other 90 pages of the article, but that footnote bothered me enough that I've spent most of the last 20 years exploring increasingly what is broken in the antibacterial space and really what we can do about it. And so that's how I ended up leading CARBX in a short story.
Excellent. Erin?
I took a little different path to CARBX. As you mentioned, I spent most of my career helping found a little company that was focused on antibiotics. It was called Rib-X at the time, and became Melinta Therapeutics. And over about 17 and a half years or so, we did just what you do in an antibiotic drug discovery group. We made new molecules, we advanced them into the clinic. And in 2017, we were lucky enough to, gain FDA approval for our first antibiotic. And that should have been, a ringing the bell or, clinking the champagne glasses or whatever the term is. And actually we did on that day. But what happened afterwards is sort of very much, I would say, emblematic of the problem in our space. So we brought in 3 additional antibiotics to pair with this, not pair as in use, but to give our marketing teams the ability to go into hospitals with more than one thing in their bags. And of those, our product and another one called Vabomere were newly minted antibiotics, and the other 2 had been on the market for a few years. And so this sounded like a dynamite recipe. But over the next 3 quarters, the sales of those, we were a public company by this point, the integral over the sales for all 4 was about at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude less than what one would need to be able to sustain them on the market. And so the company made the decision to invest in those antibiotics and to divest ourselves of research and development. So we closed that unit. As you mentioned, one of the programs that we were building, which was a little earlier in the pipeline, was one that was actually supported by CARBX. So I was aware of CARBX and its importance in our world. And so Kevin asked me to join to help to build and lead an internal R&D team to support scientifically the programs in the CARBX portfolio. And so I was very enthusiastic about doing that to support teams like my former team.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And, as we firstly investigate this theme of what we'll call the fragile antibiotic pipeline, as sort of it's termed at CARBX, I think I'd like to start off, Erin, with you a little bit. If you could just, we have this history, right, of antibiotic development. Go into some of the literature, and we see sort of the early days starting in sort of the late 1930s, this golden age of antibiotic development where we get the penicillins and the tetracyclines and macrolides and so forth. We go into this leaner phase in the 1960s, the quinolones, and then things drop off substantially. And, that's still the 1960s, or several decades ago. And sort of the opposite of that, we have all sorts of cool technologies from the screens and the combinatorial chemistry and genomics and so forth coming online. Where did we miss things along the way? Because obviously we're dealing, and Kevin will walk us through a lot of the economic stuff next, but where did things sort of go wrong early? Because, we're still several decades from where things started to get lean, sort of when I was born. What happened? And just from a purely scientific drug development perspective with antibiotic resistance along that path, even though we had all these cool technologies riding alongside of it.
That's an interesting question. I think, that as you mentioned, with the introduction of, antibiotics in the 30s, this really ushered a wave of, wow, we can prevent deaths from things that, people don't need to die from. So women don't need to die in childbirth, and people don't need to die if they, cut their hand in a gardening incident, let alone all the other ways that people die from, bacterial infections. And so, but I think, that as you mentioned, 1960s was the introduction of the last new class of antibiotics that treat sort of the broadest spectrum of bacteria. Those are the quinolones, you mentioned them. But from that period until 2000, there were introductions of new antibiotics, but they were next generation Me Too's. And when you say Me Too, what does that mean? It means simply that you modify the molecule, the drug, enough so that you bring a new improvement. Whether that's from an intravenous form to an oral form so that people can go home earlier from the hospital, whether that's better safety, or whether that's enhanced affinity for the target so that you can overcome resistance. All of those things happen. But the truth is that alongside of that research, all of a sudden, and you mentioned it, a lot of cool technologies, modern molecular biology was born in a way during that period of time, and it allowed people to start looking at other areas, for instance, oncology, or the broad area of neuroscience. And being able to sort of treat or think about building drugs in areas that people didn't do before. And so I think antibiotics were established, people were doing them, but now from a science perspective, we could unlock value in all these other areas, and it seemed kind of cool and new, which is a little different from just sort of going along as we had.
Got it. And Kevin, you've written extensively, so the other part of this fragile antibiotic pipeline picture, all sorts of economic incentives that are completely out of whack now in terms of things that are very unique in the managed care space when it comes to antibiotics versus other anti-infective products. A lot of big pharma don't want to be involved in it anymore. I was in one of them that got out of the antibiotic business when I was there. When they're not in it, VCs don't want to invest in the biotech companies that are developing, and it's a whole bad cascade. Talk a little bit about sort of this perfect storm, if you would, of poor economic incentives.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, the problem is that antibiotics work so well.
Yeah.
And that some of the generics are still working, even though they're dying. Yeah. They're still working, and they haven't. Penicillin is still useful in some settings, and some drugs that have been generic for 10 or 15 years are still useful. And so when we have a new antibiotic, the most innovative technology comes, and it makes it to the market, and Erin and her team, pop the champagne cork, and all the other teams like them. The correct reaction of the medical establishment is to, let's not use this. We can get away with using the generics or the older antibiotics for some time. Let's take this new one and put it literally behind glass on the shelf, with words on it saying break glass in case of emergency. Yeah. Let's save it for the emergency patients, the patients that fail on the other antibiotics first, and use this as little as possible. And that's the right thing for the doctor to do, and for public health. But from a company perspective, you either need high volume or high prices, or if you really want to make money, both, right? And name another technology in which the newest technology is immediately locked up and put behind the shelf. So, my iPhone here, imagine if before I was allowed to buy the iPhone, I had to prove that I couldn't get by with a 1990s flip phone. right? I had to go through a medical process of proving that the call or whatever I was about to do, we would still be using flip phones or the brick phones or landlines if that was the way technology worked in telecommunications. So for here, the most innovative technology is not sold. It doesn't get high volume. That's the right medical thing, but terrible for the companies. And the prices are typically compared to the generics because for most patients, the generics still work and they're dirt cheap. And we lack effective diagnostics to tell which patient needs the new thing and which patient can get by with the old thing. That combination is deadly. Out of the 17 antibiotics that have been approved in the US the last decade, 17, 7 out of 17, the companies related to them have gone through either bankruptcy or the functional equivalent of it. It takes, I don't know, 30 or 40 million for a company just to have the antibiotic factory going once it's going, and not even counting the cost of really the marketing team or the anything else, just the factory. And the median sales of the 17 antibiotics over the past decade was 16.2 million. When I wrote an article 2 years ago. I laid this number out. So the median antibiotic is not only losing money, it's losing a lot of money. Even if the R&D had been free, just keeping the plant running is losing the company money. Okay, so we need to figure out a different way to pay for antibiotics, because what we don't want to do is to use them a lot. That is the correct decision. Let's use them carefully in the first decade. But boy, a company can survive on low prices and high volumes, or high prices and low volumes. They can't survive on low prices and no volume, which is what they're getting right now with antibiotics. So, our goal at CARBX is to take all these great ideas that you keep reading about in science and Nature. Somebody discovered a new antibiotic, and all that means is that they've discovered something that might work in a petri dish. Getting it to the point where it works in a human is our job at CARBX. And then at the same time, we really need to think about how wealthy countries, everyone buys antibiotics and pays for them, because without a reform to that, we're not going to get out of this box.
Looking at CARBX, sort of from a couple miles up, when I first came across it, I saw it's CARBX, Boston University. I thought it was a lot smaller initiative than it actually is. But you have an amazing group of partners and funders behind this, and I'll just rattle some off here. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust. You have Germany's Federal Ministry of Education and Research. You have BARDA, part of the Preparedness and Response organization in the United States, HHS. Could both of you tag team on this one, if you would? Just talk a little bit about sort of the background, how this got put together, what goes on at BU, and sort of the network. And we'll get into, I'll come back to Erin in a little bit, talk about some of the portfolio components of this, but give us a little perspective on where CARBX sits and sort of where its tentacles go today.
Well, I have to say, you left off Her Majesty the Queen.
Nope, sorry, Queen.
So we're proud that, this is a global problem. Yeah. The world needs access to effective antibiotics, antimicrobials, and the market isn't working. We need to think of different ways to do this. So, 3 out of the 7 members of the G7, 3 out of the 7 richest countries of the world, the US, the UK, and Germany, together with the 2 foundations that donate more than anyone else to global health and global health research, Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation. These are the 5 funders of CARBX, and a substantial amount of money has been put in front of us, over 450 million at this point, and we're in discussions for renewal that will take us out another decade. And these funds are necessary because there are a lot of great scientific teams out there with 5 or 10 or 15 people, a couple of them literally working out of garage. Erin's got stories. But without the ability to translate these ideas from the university setting to the first in human testing, to make sure it kills bacteria but not us,
right?
Then it goes nowhere. And because science is hard, if we start 100 of these projects, we may only have, a dozen of those make it into first in human. And of those, only a few of those will make it actually into FDA approval. It's a large funnel. And so my goal, what we do is to collectively take, the strategic vision from these funders that the world needs these new antibacterials, and the money is given to us and it's deployed by our teams in order to try to move the science along as quickly and as aggressively as possible.
As mentioned in the intro, CARBX takes a rather broad approach: antibiotics as well as vaccines, diagnostics, and I'd love, Erin, if you could just touch on a little bit of this. And sorry, a hot topic on the show in recent months has actually been diarrhea. We've had both Paul Offit from rotavirus vaccine fame. Obviously that's viral, but we also had Emilio Mini on a couple weeks ago from the Gates organization talking about all the horrible bacteria that are out there in terms of the choleras and E. coli's and so forth, and salmonellas that are still causing a major trouble. Could you talk a little bit about Lumen Biosciences? Because we don't think of diarrhea that often, and but kills close to 1 million children a year still. Can you tell us a little bit about Lumen Biosciences, part of the portfolio?
Yeah, sure. So Lumen is an example of a monoclonal antibody that is focused on diarrheal disease caused by ETEC, so E. coli and Campylobacter. And the neat thing that they've done, because monoclonals, people know them now because of COVID, right? We have some monoclonals that are available, but typically they're parenterally, given, so intravenously. And what you'd really like, particularly, in low-income settings, is to have something oral that people can take and use and be distributed more widely. And so they produced this monoclonal in spirulina, which I don't know if you've ever thought about spirulina, but Gwyneth Paltrow's out there eating it on her popcorn, so she sort of popularized it for the world. But so they figured out how to do this in the biomass production in a way that you can have this oral product. So really very cool technology. It's early. But if proven successful, could be certainly a winner in that area of diarrheal disease.
That's very cool. Yeah, we were just talking about another company that's creating a COVID vaccine in alfalfa. So yeah, so that's pretty cool as well. Sort of this whole alternative production systems for some of these. Another interesting one, SpeedX. Here you're working with a portable battery-operated diagnostics, focusing on things like chlamydia and gonorrhea resistant strains. Again, I guess we don't think as much about the bacterial STDs nowadays as we think about, say, HIV, but they're out there rampaging through populations. Can you talk a little bit about SpeedX as well?
I'm giggling to myself. Kevin may remember this, but actually the very first time Kevin and I met, oddly, on a podcast, gonorrhea was part of the topic of conversation.
There we go.
A decade later, Kevin. Anyway,
so far your questions have been diarrhea and gonorrhea, and you answer with Gwyneth Paltrow. So
hey, what are you gonna do? And spirulina.
Okay, I'm not going to get Gwyneth Paltrow in on this one. So gonorrhea. Again, nobody thinks about it these days, but it is on the rise, and part of the reason it's on the rise is an unfortunate consequence of success in the area of medicine, and that's that as our HIV drugs have become so good, and they are prolonging lives and allowing people to enjoy their lives, in a way that has been incredible. I'm stumbling over my words, but a consequence of this is that we have higher sexually transmitted disease rates, particularly gonorrhea. And the one thing that is true is that gonorrhea is an example where gonorrhea has figured out how to evade antibiotics from every single class that's been used. And there have been many. to the level that there's only one antibiotic in one class. So this is ceftriaxone, one of the cephalosporins, that remains usually very effective, and this is worldwide. There is some resistance seen, but it's at a low level. So you have one and only one example of something that you're pretty sure you can use. And this is also in a background of where, so ceftriaxone is delivered intramuscularly. I'm told it's very painful. And so, to have options that work and that are oral, certainly would be attractive. And that's true in high-income country and low-income country settings as well. In low and middle-income country settings, a lot of the gonorrhea that is seen is due to sort of heterogeneous reasons, but there is a sex trade link too. And so having the ability to have affordable access to medicines when you need them is very important. So enter SpeedX. So SpeedX is a rapid diagnostic that is meant to say, yes, this is gonorrhea or chlamydia, but let's focus on gonorrhea here. And it also does a rapid scan of existing antibiotics, doing a quick test to determine the extent to which that gonorrhea will be susceptible. And it's focused on, the key antibiotics that are used in low and middle income country settings. So the idea is, can we say it's gonorrhea, and can we say what'll work that we have that we can deploy immediately? The additional attractiveness of this product is exactly what you said. It's portable, it's battery operated, so it doesn't need to be in some fancy university hospital setting, or care setting where, a lot of people don't have access to that. So it really is bringing it in all the places that are needed.
Very cool.
Can I follow up on just some of the economic side of this? It's
Surely.
Fascinating. So when there's not a diagnostic in the field, doctors make, for gonorrhea, they make an empiric decision.
Yeah.
And we've seen in the past that once the resistance to a particular antibiotic, gets beyond 5% or beyond 10%, they begin to flip over to the newer antibiotic because they can't tell which 10% or 20% of their patients have the resistance. So in other words, they stop using the effective generic early because they have no good diagnostics. Okay, so this machine will allow, as resistance progresses, for the patient with susceptible gonorrhea and chlamydia to use the older drug, which is good news. It's cheaper. But there are two, antibiotics against gonorrhea in phase 3 trials right now that are hoping to get to the market in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
If we're in the old world with no diagnostics, the existing world, when they come on the market, they would want to replace the existing therapy and be used all around the world and have reasonable volumes. If this diagnostic makes it to the market, you see where this is going. The two new antibiotics coming are going to have a much smaller volume because 90% of the time or 80% of the time, the old ones still work. So this diagnostic is wonderful news, right? Let's get the right drug to the right patient. But for the people with a phase 3 trial, it means their volumes might be 1/10 or 1/5 what they were hoping for. And the only way to compensate for that would be to charge 5 times or 10 times more to equal out the revenues.
Yeah.
And boy, there's nobody in global health lining up eager to pay 10 times more for right?
Yep.
So this is, again, as we push this technology, it has just odd economic effects across the ecosystem.
What, looking at, and we'll put the links to the CARBX organization, the portfolio in the show notes, but you have, a bunch of startup innovators in there, but then you also have, the GSKs of the world that you're partnering with. If I'm, a university thought leader or a startup innovator, and I have whatever that new magic bullet may be, how does the process work for someone like me to work with CARBX and interface with your team?
You want me to take that, Kevin?
No.
Okay, so how we function is by open funding calls, and we have those. We'll announce those on our website, which is www.carbx.org. carb-x.org, and also through our social media channels. And so our calls have become in recent years more focused and topical. I think in the early going, it was sort of bring us whatever. I don't care if it's a treatment, prevention, or diagnostic, as long as it targets the most urgent and serious bacterial threats that are listed on both the CDC and the WHO lists of threats, as long as it's there, and at a stage enough in development that is beyond the sort of aha moment, something that is on a trajectory towards product development. So in the vernacular for treatment and prevention, hit to lead, meaning I have something, I kind of know how it works, and now I want to optimize it, or in diagnostics case, feasibility. So again, I have a good idea about the assay, maybe a good idea about what I want that box to look like, and now I need to put these things together and optimize them. So that's the way we function. Excellent. And then once you apply, to the funding call, then it's about a 9-month to a year process where it starts with an expression of interest, which is pretty easy. You can do it over a cup of coffee. Non-confidential, just sort of give us a sense of what you have that allows us to see if you're responsive. And then it goes into a written application followed by a presentation to an advisory board who do jury the applications for us.
So in the last 5.5 years, we received like 1,190 applications. We funded 92 projects.
Yes.
The median size of the funded project, I think it's a $2 or $3 million for the base, and then there's milestone-based options. For each of those, the median size of the company or the product developer, I don't know, something like 10 FTEs. Some of them smaller. It's hard to be too much smaller. They're small, but we look at the best technology from anybody worldwide. We don't have any geographic filters or company filters. A couple of our products have been from large pharma. The two from GSK are based in their global health vaccine unit in Siena, Italy. It's really separately funded in some ways within the GSK world to focus on global health issues. But the great majority of who we work with, they're really scrappy entrepreneurs who somehow
in garages
keep their teams going. And a lot of them need a lot of help. They're great people, but there's a small team, as opposed to if this had been in big pharma, or if they had a licensing deal with big pharma, they'd have access to floors and whole buildings full of experts. These folks don't have that, and so a lot of what Erin's team does is to provide that, to give them some of that larger expertise and setting that they may or may not have.
Yeah, I was going to say, thank you for saying that, Kevin, because I think that's critical. So certainly the funding is important, but the support is critical, actually, because often these companies are very good at the foundational technology, but don't have the experience or the exposure to people with experience that know how to take those early ideas and actually bring them to the clinic, understand how to drive their profiles so that they are meaningful for patients. And so we have what we call a subject matter expert pool, which is about 150 people worldwide that represent all the disciplines that are necessary to bring these groups forward, and we offer it for free. So it's a huge gift.
So it's an outstanding model. Go ahead.
A lot of these people are folks who left big pharma when they shut down their antibiotic units.
Yeah.
So we're grateful that there's still a cadre of experienced, shall I say, gray-haired, experienced people who are nearing or at retirement age. And but my concern is keeping this going, because this is a research program that can never end.
Sure.
In a sense, not CARB-X, but just the broader antibacterial work. If we beat cancer, it's finished. We're done. right? But if we defeat the bacteria we see today, we have to keep working because we know what evolution will do. So this is one biotech innovation system that must continue forever. And I worry sometimes about the aging population of experts. Says the man with gray hair.
Understood. Understood.
Oh,
Along those lines of keeping this moving forever, the pioneering antimicrobial subscriptions to end upsurging resistance act. Kevin, you've been very active on the policy front and writing about this. It is a bipartisan Pasteur Act. What's the current status of where this, I mean, lots of things that should be bipartisan, obviously. This is one that does not discriminate. Talk a little bit about the history of this and what the current status is in 2022.
So the Pasteur Act is designed to pay for antibiotics in a different way. I think it addresses the fundamental problems that me and many others who've been writing this space have identified over the past 2 decades, which is that we need to pay for antibiotics not based on the volume of pills or shots, because we want to keep those volumes low at the beginning. We have to pay for antibiotics based on their value to society. You know, it's a safety net of immense $1 trillion value to have antibiotics in our lives. We don't even understand what the pre-antibiotic world was like. You know, the people who remember that are dead. And so, you know, how do we pay for that? And the Pasteur Act borrows a page from what England has done in a subscription model. And some people liken this to Netflix. You know, you subscribe to Netflix, you can watch one show, no shows, or you can binge 24/7 and ruin a whole week or month. But the price is the same, right? And so a Netflix model for antibiotics would take this new antibiotic that reaches the market, pay for the appropriate social value for that so the company doesn't go bankrupt. And the investors actually go away happy, so that biotech investors will invest in antibiotics for next year and next decade as well. And maybe even the medium-sized and large companies will see something that's valuable there and can integrate it into their global platforms. It's a subscription, and that the US, in the case of the Pasteur Act, would have prepaid for whatever antibiotics we need for the next decade from that company. So again, if the volumes are low or the volumes are high, the price is the same to the people, to the government, for the US. But for the company, they know what their minimum commercial revenue will be. And if that's a number that's big enough to pay for that plant and to pay for the R&D and to hopefully attract a healthy ecosystem of biotech investors.
And just from a beltway perspective, where does, like, what's happening now, like on 4/18/2022, like where does the Pasteur Act sit?
Well, you know, it was introduced at the end of the last Congress just to kind of get the conversation started. This has been the first real push during this Congress. So it's been pushing hard for a year. A lot of new co-sponsors keep getting added. And I have to say the most exciting thing was that really the Pasteur Act was described in the president's budget that came out earlier this month. Page 3 and 4 of the Health and Human Services chunk of the White House budget just describes the Pasteur Act and says, let's do that. So you have a situation in which key leaders of the Republicans and the Democrats in the House and the Senate, plus the White House, agree that this is a priority. There's 2 bills in which this could be attached to. One is the FDA reauthorization, also called PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Fee Reauthorization. That'll happen this summer. And the other one is the Pandemic Preparedness Bill, you know, the PAN-PrEP, and you know that has more politics attached to it than the FDA reauthorization. Both of these are possibilities. Currently, the Pasteur Act is attached to, it's part of what's called Cures 2.0, so the 21st Century Cures Act a few years ago, and this is like the sequel to 21st Century Cures called Cures 2.0. The same sponsors in the House and the Senate, and it's currently part of that bill, which I take to be an encouraging sign. These are members of Congress who have led in related areas for many years, and now has support both sides of the aisle and from the White House. So here's hoping that the U.S. government, in the midst of so many other challenges in the world and tragedies like the Ukraine and everything else going on, that we can actually do something thoughtful for the next generation or two.
Yep.
On bacteria.
And keep CARBX going forever. No, this is extremely
not necessarily CARBX. This is not funding to CARBX. This is funding to the companies.
Sure. Right.
It's only paying for those things that actually reach the market. Our piece is that we hope to have helped along from the university to first human trials,
right,
the companies that eventually get this award.
Sure.
But we make grants. We share no financial success there. And if we get Pasteur, the need for things like CARBX diminishes, right, because private investment should return. We're here because the private investors are not. And last thing I'll say, I know I've gone on at length, is that people don't realize how serious this problem is even today. You opened at the beginning, there's new data published in the Lancet. The data is from 2019, but it was published earlier this year. What kills more people around the world, HIV, malaria, or drug-resistant bacteria? And the answer is drug-resistant bacteria.
Yep.
It's about the same as AIDS plus malaria combined.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so all the efforts against HIV and AIDS around the world, and all the PEPFAR and Global Fund work against malaria and HIV and tuberculosis, that's been really successful in bending the curve.
Yep.
It's been so successful that now the biggest killer for infectious disease, other than COVID, today is the bacteria that we're working on. So this is not a theoretical problem 10 years hence. This is a problem now, and whatever energy people have for HIV and malaria, this also belongs at the top of that list. It's a serious issue. The Pasteur Act, it's $11 billion over a decade. That's like one latte per American per year. And in my estimation, my published work, we basically restore the economic health of the ecosystem in a sustainable fashion for generations by doing such a thing. What a bargain.
Yep.
If we'd been offered this bargain to prevent COVID, we should have taken it.
And I think, having mentioned COVID a few times here, you can think of CARBX as sort of the type of organization that's supporting the mRNA vaccine development. We're not doing that, but what we are doing is bringing forward all sorts of innovative, treatments, prevention, and diagnostics, so that when we need them, we have them. Because you just can't say, oh, heck, we have this terrible, outbreak of drug-resistant Klebsiella pneumonia. I think I'll start working on that.
Yeah.
15 years later, you might have a treatment. Right. I mean, part of the untold story of COVID, and maybe you've done a podcast on it, was all of the work that went into the mRNA technology so that it was almost ready to go. Yeah. That was decades of clever work behind that. And that sort of work is just not happening in the antibacterial space because of the dearth, the elimination of private capital, because of the economic problems I've described. And CARBX's role is to make sure that technology, the key stuff, moves forward so that it's actually ready when we need it.
Absolutely. Speaking of, I bring up COVID again, but I did last week have Peter Hotez on talking about his sort of patent-free CARBX vaccine for the 46% of the world that doesn't have access to the mRNA vaccines and so forth. And, there is this unique balance that we have in all these areas when we come to the lower income countries, not just, to the economic side, but that, in certain countries, when we talk about topics like drug-resistant tuberculosis, it's not just, there's not just one type out there. There's, these all sorts of different mutations and what have you. Say a few words, if you would, about just how CARBX looks at that component of this in terms of how it structures some of its research and the portfolio to dealing with some of these inequities between countries, not just financially, but the types of bugs that we do see out there on a global level.
It's fair to say in the COVID vaccines that governments gave a lot of money, wealthy governments, not just the US, but many others, to accelerate the production of these vaccines. And it was a miracle, and it saved so many millions of lives and allowed us to move towards normalcy. So it's a wonderful thing. They didn't address, though, at the time that they gave all those funds, this question of global access.
Yeah.
What happens with the rest of the world? And addressing it after the fact results in delays and like you said, a great majority of the world still lacking access to the mRNA vaccines. At CARBX, because of my previous academic work on precisely this issue in the context of HIV, we put into every contract, everyone who accepts funding from CARBX agrees in advance to certain standards on both access in the poor countries of the world, but also stewardship. We don't want any of these antibiotics being used as chicken growth promotion, or
Right.
There's all sorts of things that would be bad stewardship of these antibiotics. And so we have contractual commitments from each of these companies. Everyone signed the same language, whether it's the little startup or GSK or Shionogi of Japan. They all signed the exact same language, and it requires them to once they get closer to the market, so it's after they're finished with CARBX, they have to actually publish a stewardship and access plan. And it's a public document that everyone can comment on and whatnot. And then they have a private commercialization plan that Wellcome Trust has a special role in making sure that the company actually follows through on what they're doing for the developing world. So it's not perfect, but we did think of it in advance. It follows the molecules until the patent expires, and it's covered 92 projects thus far. And we think, given our position, that most of the most important, most valuable innovations in the next couple decades will be coming through our shop, and so we'll have this language on them. It will be extremely helpful in advancing this conversation, and for the companies to begin to think about this, before they reach FDA or EMA approval. Erin's had experience with talking to some of these companies about this. I don't know if you have more to say.
The one thing I did want to add is that in addition to this language and encouraging the product developers to have a stewardship and access plan as they move forward, the one great thing about operating at a portfolio level like we do is that we can bring tools to the table to help the whole, each individual project and the portfolio at whole. And so we commissioned a study last year that was meant for our treatment portfolio, sub-portfolio, and that was to ask the question, if you want to give us some of your molecules to test on contemporary bacterial isolates from around the world, so high-income country, low-income country, so that we can help you to understand how broadly active. So you mentioned, variants. Everybody understands variants now because of COVID, and that's the same thing as resistance, just different word. Idea. And so that that you work, for instance, if you're focused on Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, that you work on MRSAs that you find in US hospitals, and you work in MRSAs that you find in Indian hospitals and everywhere in between. And if you don't, then we provided these strains, these bacterial isolates, to the product developers so that as they optimize, they can see, am I making ground against these? And if so, what are the properties that seem consistent with that? And how can I use those? But then we also made those strains available to our prevention portfolio so that, for instance, with the vaccines, they could ask, are the components that I'm putting in the vaccines conserved across, these strains, again, so that I have a vaccine that's appropriate for high-income countries and low-middle-income countries. And then finally, we're giving them to our diagnostic developers in the form of challenge panels so that they can recognize, again, not only the bacterial identification, whether it's Staphylococcus aureus or something else, but then also the drug-resistant phenotypes that are being presented. And so not only, again, are we asking them for the plans for the future, but we're helping them prepare their products so that they'll be meaningful in the clinic.
So I just can't resist. You know, the contract gives a global regulatory mechanism, but it's all about contract. And what Erin is describing is that we're painting a scientific target that's based on global health, not just U.S. or Western European health. And the combination of those means that we think we're optimizing our portfolio for what the world needs. That Lancet article that we talked about, you know, the 1.27 million, it also showed, you know, that by bacteria, and the pathogens, and also by syndrome, where most of the people are dying around the world. And as soon as that came out, you know, Erin overlaid it with all the projects that we've supported by pathogen and by syndrome. And I'm happy to say that you know, 5 years before that article came out identifying where people are dying from, that's exactly where the weight of our portfolio falls. Those top 3 pathogens and top 3 syndromes. And, you know, from the beginning, CARBX has been designed to help not just a certain group of wealthy people, but to view this as a, you know, bacteria is the enemy of mankind. You know, the Black Death was a bacteria, a bacterium. And, you know, so much of human history has been tied up with people dying from these sorts of infections, and we need to be protected. And
Absolutely.
That's what we're about.
Absolutely. I want to throw one other question. I missed this one earlier, but you mentioned evolution before, Kevin. I just wanted to come back to Erin for a minute and just, this one popped into my mind as we were sitting here talking. But obviously, when you look at something like HIV and what really knocked that into control and made it, you know, people, this livable disease nowadays, you know, or these combinations, these cocktails, you know, reverse transcriptase inhibitor good, protease inhibitor better. When you put them together, wow, you know, we really did a great job. And it got me thinking about, obviously, we use, over the years, have used these antibiotics in cocktails, but usually after the fact. And I know there's been new regulations, both at FDA and EMEA in recent years, about thinking, you know, if you wanted to develop a combination early on, whether that was a combination of 2 new moieties, or maybe, you know, taking something like an amoxicillin and adding something that might not be an antibiotic per se, but a quorum sensing, something else that makes that penicillin, you know, 10 times more potent. Sorry, this question should have come a little earlier, but your thoughts on sort of the combination angle on sort of the strategy to address some of this AMR.
So, I mean, certainly there are some guidelines in place already. So if someone has a hospital-associated or ventilator-associated pneumonia, at the outset, they're typically given something that will cover the worst of the worst that you're worried about, let's say Pseudomonas aeruginosa, because many antibiotics don't target that, and then layer on something else. And only after they understand what the pathogen is will they back off. So those kind of guidelines are there. But you know, we do see in our portfolio several different types of potential combinations. So an example you mentioned, penicillin, you know, next generation cephalosporins and carbapenems, you know, the resistance to them often is in the form of these, you know, these things called beta-Lactamases, which basically clip the antibiotic open and then render it ineffective. And so then people are making, you know, beta-lactamase inhibitors. So not really antibiotics themselves, but they restore the utility of those classes. So there's that, and there are examples on the market and in the clinic where that's used. But another area that is really, I would say, trailblazing, and we're certainly doing it on a portfolio level, is an area of something like antivirulence. You mentioned GSK earlier. So GSK had another program in our portfolio that has graduated because it completed its first in human. And this was with something, it was an inhibitor of a target that's on the bladder epithelium. Okay, and so the idea is by binding to that, anyway, you basically prevent E. coli or Klebsiella from attaching to the bladder, an adhesion protein, and therefore, not causing urinary tract infections. So, hopefully we'll see if that works. Now that's meant to be standalone, but, other antivirulence inhibitors, again, aren't antibiotics, but coupled with an antibiotic, should enhance the performance. And so again, this is new area, and we have a number of these in portfolio, but that's a different kind of strategy, not pairing two direct acting antibiotics, things that can be adjunctive and enhance the overall therapy.
Very cool. Really cool. Sorry I asked that out of order, but nonetheless, I thought it was an important talking point.
And the lawyer can't resist. So Erin just buzzed me if I go off base here, but where I'm asked frequently about why can't we just do combinations of lots of older antibiotics the way that we do the HIV cocktails, and there's a couple of responses. One is that when they actually do these studies, they find that some antibiotics are synergistic, they help one another, and some are antagonistic. They actually fight against each other. And so the antagonisms are such that sometimes the antibiotics that are being used, that the doctor is giving you 2 or 3 different things, sometimes that might not actually be a positive additive effect. It might be the opposite. Second main thing is that if you do that, you're almost guaranteed then to have wiped out all the commensal non-pathogenic bacteria in your gut, because you've taken 2 or 3. You're just going to wipe it clean. You don't really have this problem with HIV. That taking these extra cocktail drugs are going to wipe out your beneficial microvirome within your body, and so I understand the appeal of let's just do combination. Doctors do that every day, in trying to add things, but bringing a pill to the market that's a combination, with the exception of the ones that Erin has talked about, has not historically been useful. In fact, a lot of the FDA regulation of antibiotics in the 1950s focused on all sorts of crazy combination therapies that companies brought to the market with very little empirical data to support it. And when the 1962 amendments that really ushered the modern FDA came about, it was largely, a lot of that was in response to the need to prevent, combinations that didn't have any basis in science.
No, excellent point. Give that man a PhD next to his JD. Oh no, really.
It's more education.
No, it's a really fascinating program, and just amazing what you've put together and the structure. And it's it's just such a pressing issue as we move forward. Any hot items anything coming up in 2022 that you can mention? Conferences that you are both going to be presenting at? Any other things in the sort of the policy area? Anything I've missed that you want to put on the table for CARBX, please, both of you take the floor.
Erin, you want to do conferences and meetings?
Yeah, sure. So, the big conferences of the year, the international conferences, there are a couple upcoming. Actually, one is next week in Lisbon. It's called ECCMID, ECCMID. And this is the European Infectious Disease Meeting of the Year, but it's global. Everybody goes. And that's a place where you'll see a lot of our product developers, as well as those in advanced development, presenting, the status of their programs. So that's certainly one to go to. I would say the US equivalent of that is in June. This is something supported by ASM. It's called ASM Microbe, and that'll be in June in Washington, D.C. And then ID Week is a big one, and that's more on the clinical side of things, and that will also be in Washington, D.C. in October. So those are 3 certainly big conferences. And then the 4th is a joint meeting between ASM, again, the American Society for Microbiology, and ESCMID, which is the European equivalent, and that's called ASM ESCMID, clever name. but that's now hopefully going to happen this year. We've now been 2 years in the waiting in Dublin, and that again will be where a lot of our product development go. And on the back side of that meeting, we will have a product developer meeting, so in person, people in our portfolio, and give them opportunities to interact, share lessons learned, maybe find collaborations, etc.
So policy things to watch. The United Kingdom, England just announced its technical economic reviews on its subscription Netflix model, and that should become finalized over the summer. It's the two drugs they selected are public knowledge, and they're moving forward with that. I want to see actual motion on Pasteur for Pasteur to make it into a bill that gets out of one of the houses and the House or the Senate and goes to a conference and moves on to the president, where the president will sign it. And for CARBX, we've been working for a while on what's next for us, and we think that we should have a positive announcement within 60 days on kind of what the future looks like for us, and look forward to the time when we'll be able to announce additional rounds once we've achieved and announced that future funding. But nothing to announce today, sadly.
Well, you've announced quite a bit nonetheless, and this is once again, it's a fascinating story. I wish you both much success as you continue to move things forward, both on the R&D front as well as the policy front. For everybody that is going to be listening to this episode across the podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Erin Duffy, Chief of Research and Development, Kevin Outterson, Executive Director, both of CARBX, the Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria Biopharmaceutical Accelerator. Erin, Kevin, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show today and talk to us for a little while. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing there at CARBX. And as we like to say on this show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow through everything you're doing. It's really such an amazing story.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yep, absolutely.